Alright guys, so I'm going to start a new series on the channel over here, and it's going to be a beginner's guide, and I thought it would be really good to do a beginner's guide to hand traps, because I think hand traps are like one of the more important things to kind of understand when getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Because you could be like, oh man, I haven't played in like 10 years, can I still play Blue Eyes? And it's like, yeah, you can still play Blue Eyes, they got new support, all that good stuff. Can you still play Heroes? Yeah, but you got to understand like what all these new, like, you discard a card and you're like, what, they're like negating my effects from the hands, they're activating imperm from the hand, that's a trap card, don't you gotta set that? It's kind of like understanding these things, right? Because a lot of the metas are shaped around certain hand traps, right? If like certain hand traps are good, you can kind of tell what the meta is like if you're in a meta and you see like Ghost Reaper is really good, that meta is probably really toxic, right? So I thought it'd be really good and really pertinent of me to actually make this video and do a couple series of videos just kind of giving everybody like the basic gist behind a lot of these like different staple cards or like things that are kind of going on in current Yu-Gi-Oh! So we're going to talk about all of these today. I think this covers pretty much the gist of like all of like the random bad hand traps that you might encounter, some of the old ones that people don't really use anymore, and some of the more modern ones that are pretty good. But before we begin, if you have not already, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for, you know, future Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. And if you want to see me play Yu-Gi-Oh! Well, let me tell you that November 12th, I'm actually doing a Gozen match tournament, which means that everybody is only allowed to use one attribute of monster for their entire deck. If that sounds like something that you want to participate in, go ahead and DM me in my Discord, which is linked down in the description down below, and I will sign you up for that tournament. But that basically means like you got to run an all-wind deck, or an all-water deck, or all-fire. I know light and dark is probably going to be super prevalent, but I'm really excited to see what wacky decks people come up with for the tournament. But with all that being said, let's just go in order. So Karibo's kind of like the OG hand trap. Basically, if you're going to take any damage, you can discard Karibo, and you're not going to take, you know, any damage, right? It's pretty simple, right? Like, so someone's gonna hit you with a big attack, you don't want to take that 3k from that Blue Eyes over there, you discard Karibo. And a lot of the Karibos are kind of here represented by this Karibo slot, because most of them just, I don't know, you don't really care a whole lot for that, and there's just better hand traps that you can run. Some of the Karibo cards are actually not bad, like Rainbow Karibo kind of like locks down an opponent's monster and also protects you from damage, so like that's one that's like not super bad, right? And things like Astral Karibo can actually be run in like Galaxy Eyes decks. So those ones have a little bit more sway, but they're also like a lot newer than OG Karibo. But I thought it'd be pertinent to bring up because, hey, it's Karibo. He's the original guy. Now, next we have like actually a hand trap that is really good, and you probably will be seeing depending on the format, and that's DD Crow. Basically, you discard DD Crow and you're able to banish one card in your opponent's graveyard. The reason this is really good is that you can cause certain cards to miss timing. So for instance, let's say you're playing against Drytron, right, and they tribute for one of their different Drytron monsters, it doesn't matter which one, they tribute Ben 10, right? And Ben 10 in the graveyard is trying to activate to add a fairy from your deck to your hand. Well, you can actually use DD Crow to disrupt that, right? Like actually, for whatever reason, it causes the effect to whiff for Ben 10 because it's no longer in the graveyard. You know, it just kind of whiffs. Very, very strange how that kind of rules out. I don't think it should be able to do that, but DD Crow has a lot of very weird interactions because of stuff like that. It's also really good in formats where stuff like DPE, for instance, are really good, because DPE has to be in the graveyard to revive itself. You can chain your DD Crow and you can actually just banish it from the graveyard and it never comes back again. So DD Crow is always just kind of generally pretty good because the graveyard is seen as like a second hand in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So having a card that can basically, you know, quote unquote rip a card out of their second hand is always pretty nice. Battle Vader is very similar to something like Karibo. It's on here because you unironically might run into this in ladder. If somebody is running Battle Vader in their deck, they're probably running something like Exodia or like Numeron or some like really stally gimmicky deck. Basically, if you try to declare direct attack, you special summon Battle Vader, boom, you end the battle phase, right? It's pretty simple, right? It's really just a like stall card. There's also like a Scarecrow card that does the exact same thing. So it's like, if they're running cards like Battle Fader or like the Scarecrow that's very similar to Battle Fader, they're probably running some like gimmicky, not very good deck. But hey, you actually might run into it on like Master Duel and stuff, because Master Duel is a very, I would say, gimmicky format where everybody's just kind of running whatever they want. It's pretty much the Wild West of Yu-Gi-Oh! Effect Veiler is actually really nice as well. This is another one of the better hand traps because basically it just allows you during your opponent's turn to negate one card or one monster card that they have, and it's non-once per turn. A lot of these other hand traps, some of the more modern ones, you'll actually notice that they are once per turn. You can't just spam use their effects, right? Because that actually might be a little broken, and it causes you to kind of maybe ratio out your hand traps and not play too many of certain ones, right? Because you don't want to like double up on them, right? Like if you have 2 Ash Blossoms in your hand, it kind of sucks, right? Because you're like, well, I can only really use the one. Veiler, while you can only use it during your opponent's turn, which is when they're primarily going to be doing a lot of stuff, it's really nice because if you open all 3 Veilers, you can use all 3 Veilers, and it's very, very good for that. A little bit of debate back and forth between people using Veiler or Imperm, but we'll get to Imperm when we get to it. But just know that this card sees a lot of play as well. It also has some niche use because like a lot of the more newer hand traps, it's also a tuner. So you can also use it for like actual plays, right? Like you could actually like normal summon your Veiler while you have like, I don't know, some level 4 and go into a level 5 synchro, right? For instance. So it also sees play because of that as well. Then you have Droll and Lockbird. Basically, if your opponent adds a card to the hand, you can then discard Droll and Lockbird, and they cannot, it just turns into Thunder Dragon Colossus, basically, right? You can't like add cards from the deck to the hand, right? Which is really insane. Droll and Lockbird is one of those hand traps that sees more play, kind of depending on what is in the meta right now. Like if the meta is a little slower, right, or maybe a little more stally, it might not see as much play. But if there are like decks that are just raring to go and they're just like tearing through their deck because they need to do this insane combo, Droll typically sees a lot more play to kind of put a stop to that. Herald of the Orange Light, the reason I have this one here is this is more like archetypal hand traps. You'll notice that a lot of archetypes will have like their own built-in hand traps, and Herald of the Orange Light is generally like just pretty good, right? There's other heralds as well that like you could play in fairy decks. Like there's green light that negates spells, there's purple that negates traps, but because monster effects are generally the ones that you want to negate and you want to destroy those monsters as well to further disrupt your opponent, people typically will play orange light in like some fairy related deck or specifically in something like Drytron. Also, it's a tuner, so you can also use it for, you know, extension plays as well if you need to go into it like that. So you notice that like a lot of archetypes will kind of have their built-in hand traps. Some of those are generally pretty good in the archetypes. They're generally not super, super bad or anything. So yeah, that just kind of represents those. If your archetype has itself like a built-in hand trap, generally it's not bad to play. But then again, there are some stinkers. So don't use it as a generic, you know, blanket term, especially if it's like a more like older archetype and the hand traps aren't as good. Maxi is probably one of the most infamous hand traps of all time. It's got a very, very simple effect. You can discard Maxi, and anytime your opponent would special summon a monster, you draw a card. Now, you can only activate one Maxi per turn, so, you know, if they, like, negate your first Maxi with, like, an Ash Blossom or something, you can't pop the other one, but it doesn't really matter, right? Because Maxi is one of those cards that can literally end the game, right? Because you don't want your opponent to have more card advantage than you do, and because that's kind of the whole name of the game with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is maintaining your card advantage, right? Like, if you've got like 7 cards and your opponent's got 3, you're ahead of your opponent, right? Generally speaking. And Maxi pretty much will just like let you tear through so much of your deck and just kind of obliterate whatever your opponent's got. Especially because you can Maxi and draw into something like an Ash Blossom or a Nibiru or like a DD Crow or something, right? Like you can draw into like other cards that actually help you out and further disrupting your opponent. And so a lot of people, they'll see Maxi and they'll pass turn, right? Which is why it's like super, super infamous, because you do not want your opponent to draw cards at all. And if you pass turn without like doing anything, you're pretty much guaranteed to die. So then it's like, do you either allow your opponent to draw all these cards and just pray you can lock them down and pray that they don't like draw into like Nibiru or something? Or do you just pass turn and like hopefully just pray that they can't kill you, right? Which is why it's super, super controversial, right? And like why this is like a card that I would say most players do not like, but there are some people that are like, yeah, dude, I freaking love Maxi, dude, Earth Insect, let's go. So this is definitely one that you probably play in every single deck at 3, right? Just because it almost reads, there's a chance you just win the duel, right? Like that's pretty much what it says. It's like really, really insane. Gamma's a really good hand trap because it's a hand trap that can counter other hand traps, because basically you just negates monster effects and then it special summons a driver from your hand, deck, or graveyard. And if you do this on your turn, like so let's say your opponent tries to Maxi you and you have Gamma, you can negate that and now you have 2 bodies on the field. And for anybody curious, the Gamma plus the Driver also equals a level 8 Synchro, and there's a lot of really good just level 8 Synchros you could go into, like Psy-Frame Gear Omega. I cannot speak today, but you can go into that stuff. Unfortunately, if you do it on your opponent's turn, they get banished at the end of the turn, so you don't get to keep them if you use it on their turn. But if you use it on your turn, it's almost like you just get 2 free bodies on the board as well, which is really, really nice. I have the other, like, the other C cards, because if you didn't know, like, Max C is not the only, like, cockroach card we got, right? There's other ones. The others generally aren't super, super great. The only other one that's, like, pretty good is Retaliating C, but we'll get to that in a second. Flying C is just, like, your opponent cannot exceed summon, and there's another one that's like your opponent can't synchro summon, and this is kind of representing both of those slots. It's not super great. Like, don't run these, and they're not that good, right? They, like, maybe you could side deck them for a tournament if you're like, I feel like a lot of people are going to be running Exceed monsters in this tournament, I'm going to side deck this in. I don't know, might be kind of funny, but they probably do have link monsters, and they'll just like link it off or something, so, you know, who cares? Then we have Ghost Ogre. Ghost Ogre, basically, it's kind of like Veiler, right? In that, like, you know, when your opponent activates something, you know, you can chain Ogre, but instead of negating it, you blow it up. The reason Ogre is really good is that, like, stuff like continuous traps and stuff, like, or like specifically against the adventure cards, Ogre's really, really good against, right? Because you can like pop a lot of their the spells that they're trying to activate. So it was kind of specifically good in that. And Ogre's kind of another one of those hand traps that is more telling of what the format is like. It's not quite as bad as, like, if Cherries is really good right now, but if Ogre is, like, really good, it's like, there's probably a lot of, like, sussy spell trap stuff going on right now, and I don't know if I'm a huge fan of what's going on, you know, it's kind of like that. But it's generally pretty good. If you run Ogre, probably not going to go wrong doing that. I just think it would be better to run other hand traps, but it's not bad to run. Cherries is extremely toxic. If this card is being played in decks, the format is ruined, because what Cherries allows you to do is that you can reveal a card in your extra deck, and you can look in your opponent's extra deck, and if you guys have the same card in your extra deck, you can banish all copies of that card. Generally, what that means is that, like, everybody's playing the same deck at that point, or people are specifically putting cards in their extra deck to counter the, like, really strong decks right now. Like, for instance, you know, when I go to, like, locals and stuff, and Tier Element and Sprite are, like, really good right now, I was playing Exosister, and I just threw in a Gigantic Sprite, and I just threw in a Kit Kalos into my extra deck and sided in, like, the Cherries, right? And I would just board into that. If I saw that I was going up against them, I'd put those in, because those are, like, kind of, like, main combo-y guys for both of those decks. And so it's just like, that's how you know that, like, there's kind of a problem, right? It's like when people are, like, specifically doing stuff like this, it's really good if you're playing, like, a rogue deck in those matchups, right? And you need a way to, like, actually counter them and actually be able to play. But I'm sure that what I just described does not sound like it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a healthy metagame. It's like, no, that means we're in, like, the nuclear option. So you probably will never have to make winner Cherries, because Master Duel is such a diverse format. You know, pretty much a lot of, like, all of these major decks are still meta. I mean, the fact that I can still get away with playing Drytron or, like, VW or something, I mean, well, less so VW now that VFD is banned, but the fact that I can still get away with that, and we're in 2022, and we also have, like, Despia guys running around, and Sprite and Tier, well, we'll see what happens with Sprite and Tier Element come out, but the fact that we have all these decks running around, it should be diverse enough, especially for a bit. Now, when Sprite and Tier Elements come out, I would just an eye and maybe save some UR points. You know, if you're playing your little hero deck, you might need it to kind of banish out some of their cards. Ash is probably the most common hand trap in the game, because what it does is it allows you to shut down your opponent trying to interact with their deck. Like, so if they're trying to draw a card, it can negate that. If they're going to special summon from the deck, it can negate that. If they're going to send a card from their deck to the graveyard, it can negate that. Now, it is once per turn, so you can only do it once, but it's generally pretty destructive, right? So, like, if they go Pot of Desires, right, and they have to banish 10 cards from their deck to draw 2, they still have to banish those 10 for cost, and then you can negate that with Ash Blossom, right? Which is really insane. So basically, you just made them go like minus 11, right? They wasted the Pot of Desires, and they also banished 10 cards for no reason. So Ash is really, really insane. I'm pretty sure this is just another one you play in every single deck, right? You pretty much max this out at 3 alongside Maxi. They're just kind of like your better hand traps to run. And the other stuff is kind of like dependent, right? Like something like Nibiru as well. Like Nibiru, we'll talk about that when we get there. But this is one of those ones that everybody probably should get. I mean, they have it in a pack for a reason. Like they have it as like a starter pack for you to be able to get for like 600 gems for a really, really good reason. This is just one of those like staple cards that everybody really runs. Ghost Bell is kind of the same thing, but it's for the graveyard, right? Like if you say that like Ash Blossom is designed to shut down interacting with the deck, Ghost Bell is designed to shut down your interactions from the graveyard, right? So like if your opponent's trying to interact with the graveyard or their second hand, Ghost Bell is really good. This is actually one that you can get away with playing like 1 or 2 in your deck because it's not bad, because most decks are going to do something with their graveyard at some point. And so it gives you like a little bit more diversity in your hand trap. So it's like, oh, instead of like drawing 3 Ash, right? If you go like the OCG in particular, they go double for all their hand traps. So they'll go like double Ash, double Ghost Bell, double Maxi, right? So you have less odds of opening up like both of your Ashes, and you might instead open like Ash and Ghost Bell, right? And that way you can actually use both of them, so technically now you have 2 forms of disruption instead of bricking on only having the 1 form of disruption, right? So Ghost Bell's actually really good, not a bad card to use. I don't know why Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood is a UR, because basically this is just a life point card. Maybe it's good in like tournaments if you're actually like sighting in and you're like doing best of 3s, because basically every time your opponent special summons an effect monster, you gain life points, right? And so you can get a mad amount of life points, right, by using this card. And if you don't know, Konami, how they run Yu-Gi-Oh, they have a thing called time rules, right? And so basically, if time runs out, whoever has the most life points at the end of that duel wins the duel, right? Or at the, like whenever time was called, obviously. And so something like this, where you can just net yourself like 10,000 life points because they summoned all over the place, you could pretty much just like game them at that point. But even still, people just tend not to run this card, right? Not even for the downside, because it does have a downside that if like you don't get any life points, your life points are halved. But you can just chain this to like an effect that's going to special summon, right? So like you can guarantee get it. It's kind of like what people do with Maxi. You know, like once they see that they're committing to something that's actually going to summon a card, they will drop Maxi, right? So they can guarantee get the draw, right? Because then you can't take it back. You've already activated the effect. And so Spooky Dogwood's very similar. I just don't think it's super good to run. Mourner's actually not terrible, right? It's kind of like Veiler, right? In that like you can negate the effect of a card your opponent controls, but then if it leaves, you know, you get to burn for the attack set of that monster, right? So that's kind of nice. It's like Veiler with a little bit of extra burn. It's not super terrible, but again, probably not something you're going to be running. Like in real life Yu-Gi-Oh, you would kind of run this because it's more of like a budget card, right? Like if you can't afford something like Ash, because Ash was like 30 bucks or something, and they just like reprinted this like 2 or 3 times or something, because I have like 9 of these things now. But like it was just one of those cards that like, for instance, I would run because, you know, like just not being able to afford like getting a playset of Nibiru, right? Because Nibiru is like 10 bucks, and I was like, man, I'm not paying 10 bucks for no rock. But it was kind of like that. It's just kind of like a placeholder. But in Master Duel, it kind of loses that budget value because for whatever reason, it's a UR. I don't know why this one's a UR, this one's a UR. Like this should probably be like a rare. Like maybe Ogre could be like an SR, and like these are the 2 UR ones. I have no idea why they're all URs. It's super baffling. But yeah, it kind of just loses a lot of the value. I mean, you might need it particularly, right? Because like it's like a zombie and it's wind, but like they're all zombies. So it's like I don't really see the value in that. They're all tuners. They're all level 3. I just don't, yeah, I don't really get the appeal, right? Like there's not really like a scenario where I'm like, oh yeah, you would run like Mourner over something else, right? It'd have to be like very specific, right? Like it's kind of good for time because again, you get that burn, right? And burn is always like pretty decent. So I don't know. Not one of the better hand traps that you'd really want to be running. Skullmeister is kind of one of those like quote-unquote archetype ones that I'm talking about. I use quotes because it's not really like a part of an archetype, but it's kind of like a ghost spell, but a little worse, right? But you like run this in like Red Dragon, right? Because you can also use it as like a level 4 for synchro plays, but I thought I'd just go ahead and bring it up just because it is one of like the hand traps that you kind of do see. Some people do even like play outside of stuff like Red Dragon just because it's like, oh yeah, like you can negate something in the graveyard. It's like, nice, cool, whatever. Retaliating Sea, this is the other sea card that's actually a little good, because if your opponent activates a spell, so like a fusion card or like a ritual card that's going to summon one of their monsters, or like Unexpected Die that special summons a normal monster from the deck, you get to summon this guy for free, and then it's Macrocosmos. If you don't know what Macrocosmos does, basically any card that goes to the graveyard is banished instead, and that turns off a lot of cards in the game. Because a lot of cards in the game need to go to the graveyard specifically. They don't just like auto redirect, right? Something like, say, Karibo, or just says you can discard this card. This one is still fine, but if it's like you can send this card to the graveyard, well, you can't send it to the graveyard anymore because the graveyard like functionally just doesn't exist while this card is up, right? It kind of just puts a big X over the graveyard. Things are only going to the banish zone. So that's really, really nice, right? It's super good for disrupting your opponent's plays. The only thing that's kind of nasty is that you have to wait for them to use a spell card that actually like summons a monster, which can be a little annoying because there's some cards that like it doesn't proc for that you would think it would, so that can be a little annoying, but it is really, really strong. It's also like if you're gonna run it in like B Trooper decks or any insect-based deck, you get to like search Maxi, right? Because 15 or less attack, and this guy's got 500, so you get to search that. It's really, really insane. So it's kind of also like a combo piece as well. So it's like one of those hand traps that's also part of the deck. Same thing for like Mercurier, right? Mercurier also just kind of like a Veiler for like branded Tri-Brigade, but then if it gets banished, you get to add a Fallen of Albaz. Stuff like that is really good. Like these kind of like, I don't want to like, cause I don't want to say like new wave of like hand traps, but like stuff like this is like really, really strong because not only does it provide disruption on your opponent's turn, but also during your turn, you can actually use it to kind of like get your combo going, right? And if you have ever played like Tri-Brigade or even Branded, and especially so in Branded Tri-Brigade, they banish a lot of their cards, right? They banish a lot of these cards, and this guy's got pretty favorable like attributes about him. Like he's got a Tri-Brigade name, he's Winged Beast, and he's Dark, so he's got a lot of good things going for him. Lancia is always really good as well. This is just kind of like a generic, really good hand trap because it basically just says nobody can banish cards, right? So like you can turn off being able to banish stuff. And a lot of cards in the game do like to be banished, right? Like for instance, in like Dragon Link, right? Like they want to banish a light or a dark card for like their Collapse Servant or Wyverburster, right? You just drop this and you're like, nope, there's no banishing anymore. So that kind of turns off a lot of cards in the game because there are a lot of cards that do just banish for their effect, but kind of depends on what's meta right now. You know, it's like one of those cards that's a meta call because it's generally, yeah, if you play it in every deck, it'll probably be fine sometimes, but it's better to play when you know there's a lot of decks running around that are like actively banishing a lot of their cards. Contact Sea is one of those cards that like seems like it would be really good. Don't run it. It's like on paper it's good because you're like, ah, yes, I stick Contact Sea on my opponent's board and they have to use it for Fusion, Synchro Exceed, or Link Summoning, right? Like they have to use this card first, and that can kind of like turn off their other cards. The problem is that, well, sure, like maybe it doesn't fit into like a Fusion Summon. Synchro Summoning is a little bit iffy because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these hand traps are tuners, so like they could just normal summon Orange Light, for instance, and go into a level 8 Synchro, or they could just normal summon Ash and go into a level 9 Synchro if they have it, right? So like you kind of run the risk of that. Maybe it won't happen, maybe not, kind of depends. The Synchro one's a little iffy. Exceed is probably never going to get used for that anyway because level 6 is like the most random like level for Exceeds. Like unless you're playing like exactly VW, it's probably not going to come up. The problem is Link Summoning. The problem is Link Summoning because, for instance, you have things like the Nightmare cards that literally are just like, screw it, just get me 2 guys and you can make whatever you want. If this also shut down Link Summoning, it would be broken. But the fact that like so many Link monsters are just like, yeah, just get me effect monsters, right? Like just get me dudes on the board. That's kind of why Contact Sea is really not super great. And that's kind of my like, it's like one of those traps that like you read it and you're like, oh, this is probably really good. And then you start thinking about it a little bit more. And you're like, well, this card's probably bad. Like this card's probably dog water. Then you have Gores. Gores I have to bring up because he's like the OG guy. The problem is that even if you're trying to be like funny and you're gonna like get somebody with Gores, everybody naturally plays around Gores. If you don't know what it does, because maybe you're a bit more new to the game, it was kind of like the like Karibo's like the OG hand trap because it's like the first one, but Gores is like the OG hand trap because it's like the one that everybody was playing. Because what happens is when your opponent attacks you and they deal damage to you, you get to summon Gores, and then you get to summon a token that's as big as the damage you took. So it forced people to always play around it by going from their weakest monster to their strongest monster, right? So like, and people to this day still play around Gores because, you know, no one wants to be caught off guard and be like, well, I attack you with my Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and now you have a 4,500 token that is going to be pretty hard for me to out, because now I got to crash with it, or I got to, you know, just let my guys get obliterated. So Gores are kind of like an OG one. You can play it if you want to be a little bit funny, but people kind of just naturally play around it anyway. Nibiru is another like pretty staple one. It's kind of called like the teeth for Maxi, right? And what I mean by that is that Maxi allows you to draw a lot of cards, but if you're not drawing into hand traps, you're kind of just drawing cards and being like a little boogeyman for your opponent, right? It's a little spooky. But Nibiru gives it teeth, right? Because then Nibiru contribute your opponent's entire board, like all of their monsters, right? If they've summoned 5 or more times, right? So, and then you can, whenever they try to go to battle phase, you can just wait until they're ready to go to battle, and you can just tribute the entire board, right? You can just wait. The problem is that you want to drop it before they have like a monster negate. So like if someone drops like a Baron, for instance, which is a really common like, you know, just Omni negate card that a lot of people are running. If they just drop a Baron, Baron can negate the Nibiru, right? So you don't want to like, you know, Nibiru a little too late. You kind of got to like know when the choke points are for the deck. Like it's like right when they're about to like start going into some of their crazy stuff, boom, you sweep the entire board. Because for a lot of decks, it's kind of iffy if they can get to like their main like monster negates before 5 summons, and so that can make it a little bit iffy for them. So that's kind of why Nibiru is pretty good, right? Like it's just like it kind of forces people to play a little bit differently, because you're trying to get to your monster negate before 5 summons, because you don't want all of your guys to get tributed, right? So Nibiru is always really good. Maybe always like play just like 1, maybe 2 if you're playing Maxi, right? Which you should be playing Maxi. For me, it kind of depends on what deck I'm running. If I can fit into, I might play them. But if I can't, I probably will just play 1. And then we actually have like actual hand traps. Like these are actual trap cards. So evenly matched, basically end of battle phase. If you control no cards, smack this card down. Your opponent basically banishes all of the cards they control except for 1, because you know, you only control evenly matched, and they have to match how many cards you control, and you know, they'll have to like banish all those cards, and then you can proceed as per usual during your main phase too. Like evenly matched is one of those like blowout going second cards. It is super, super insane. Kind of similar to like Red Reboot. Like Red Reboot, if you're like playing it in a specific deck to counter traps, this thing is insane, because not only do you negate the trap, sure, you get to like let them set a trap card from their deck, but for the rest of the turn, you just lock them out of trap cards. So like if you're playing against like Eldritch or something, this just like kills the deck, because it's like for the rest of the turn you're not doing nothing, right? Like not only did I get to negate your trap, but I also just got to blow out your entire back row for no reason, right? This is another one of those controversial cards, because like trap enjoyers really hate it, because it literally just says if I draw Red Reboot, you're screwed. Like you're toast. Like, so this is one of those ones that maybe you could run 1 or 2 in your like main deck for Master Duel if you're worried about getting blown out by some random trap deck. But I don't know, like stuff like Lich is kind of falling in popularity. Altergeist doesn't look like it's really making much moves, so maybe it's not all that like insane to actually run. But yeah, if you ever see that there's like a huge like trap deck, like I don't know, if like Labyrinth comes out for Master Duel and they're just like stupid insane, bring in Red Reboot. Finally, there's Imperm. Imperm is basically the trap version of Effect Veiler. And what Imperm does is basically you just get to target an effect monster your opponent controls, you negate that, and then if you actually set this, so you kind of get rewarded that if you actually set it as a normal trap, then when you whenever you negated that monster, all the cards in that column, right, are negated for the rest of the turn. And you'll see so many people try to activate spell cards in the Imperm column, because they'll forget that Imperm negated everything in that column, and then they'll still try to activate cards in there, and it's really funny. A guy at a recent YCS did it twice while he was the feature match, and it was really funny. But I hope this helped you guys out. I know this video is a little bit long. I hope you guys enjoyed this little discussion video. And hey, maybe if you were a longer time Yu-Gi-Oh player, you also kind of like learned a little bit about like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about someone like Skullmeister. I know there's like specific hand traps that I left out. Like I didn't bring out any of the other Psy frame gears because they're, you know, similar to Orange Light, right? The other frame gears are like a spell negate or a trap negate or like negate a summon, right? Like they're all like very similar, but Gamma is the one that people are primarily going to run, and you'll see that kind of trend with even like Orange Light, that you really want to hit those monster effects, right? Like those are the ones that you really want to start negating, and that's why those two are like the ones that actually see common play in decks that they can be running. But anyway, if there is another tutorial video that like maybe some newbies down in the comments are like, hey, I don't really get this, I'll make a video on it. As you can see right here, I'm not afraid to make a long, lengthy video talking about all this stuff. blowing out my voice, but yeah, I'm definitely down to do that. I love Yu-Gi-Oh! I love helping out new players, and I love seeing new people kind of join into the game. So with all that being said, leave your suggestions in the comments down below, and I will catch you guys in the next video whenever that may be. Peace, late guys.